Part 33 begins a 5-part set on the Jesuits, and if the past is any indication, we'll be in conspiracy land before long. We'll start with a biographical sketch of Ignatius of Loyola, which is mostly correct, though it leaves a lot of matters curiously unspecified. It would be nice to know what fairly means by this, because it leaves us to ask whether Ignatius was in trouble for something serious like murder. Actually, he got in trouble for brawling, which, while serious, doesn't exactly make him any worse than many teenagers these days who go on to live perfectly productive lives. I don't think Fairley is qualified enough as a psychologist to make such an assessment, but even so, he could arguably be said to be correct. As it happens, this author who wrote a biography of Ignatius is a qualified psychologist. Meisner mentions that Ignatius had a convalescence after some painful surgery for an injury received in battle, and a few months of depression that drove him to the brink of suicide. Maybe that could be called a nervous breakdown. But again, let's keep in mind that there are plenty of people who endure such things and go on to live perfectly normal lives. So hopefully Fairley doesn't think we should be milking that for effect. As for Jesus as a military commander, that's true, but not the whole story. The biography on the Marquette University website says that Ignatius dreamt about serving God as St. Francis, St. Dominic, and the other saints. It also alludes to concepts of spiritual warfare held by Ignatius. But this is an idea in general terms you can find just as readily discussed by Protestant evangelicals, not to mention in the Bible itself. It's correct that a biography of Francis was a particular inspiration, but what Ignatius actually read was a life of Jesus, plus a work called Flos Sanctorum, which is presumably what Fairley considers to be fanciful. The visit part noted here really did happen, and it did last for 3 days, but despite Fairley's protest, the figure there doesn't qualify as an idol, much less is it related to the pagan goddess Ashera. The statue doesn't qualify as an idol because it's not a representation of a god, and it's not assumed that a god comes down to speak through it. The designation of it as Ashera? That's just fanciful assumption based on Fairley's mystery religion thesis, borrowed from Hislop. It's true Ignatius wanted to go to Jerusalem, but for a pilgrimage, not for conquest. But he avoided Barcelona in order not to be recognized by those who would know and honor him. Fairley may be confusing this with a later episode in which Ignatius started from Barcelona on a journey to Jerusalem, and was heading for Rome while there was plague there. Ignatius did stay in Manresa, but it was to stay at a hospital for a few days while he took down some notes. Ignatius didn't spend all of that time in a cave. He spent most of his time there lodged in a cell connected to a priory, or staying in rooms provided by local benefactors in their homes. He only spent time in the cave for prayer and penitence. The connection Fairley makes between caves and demonic activity, as we noted with Muhammad, doesn't deserve any credence. We may as well point out that David stayed in a cave, and that Elijah hid prophets loyal to God in a cave. Now, using Fairley's logic, this means David and Elijah were inspired by demons. Or we could just think that caves were good places for ancient people who were traveling to camp out. Not really quite right. Meisner says that all Ignatius did was not eat meat or drink wine. He also let his hair and nails grow as a sort of reversal of his prior bodily vanity. And he kept awake for prayer vigils rather than sleeping sometimes. The closest any of this comes to torture is that Ignatius ate so little that he suffered from a degree of malnutrition. But let's face it, people of that time didn't realize the health problems that such deprivation might cause. And Jesus himself didn't eat for 40 days, so is Fairley going to say Jesus subjected himself to torture? This is true, but let's not get all hasty thinking this was Satan running around. For one thing, the being never spoke to Ignatius or did anything but sit there, and you'd think Satan, if it really were him, would have better things to do than stand around like he was at a bus stop. For another, as I've said before, we need to be careful of giving Satan too much credit. These days, when we have teachers like Joyce Meyer thinking Satan spends his time ruining family barbecues to make people feel bad, it's all too easy to blame Satan for anything we don't like. Ignatius finally did decide that he must be seeing the devil. I think it was more likely simply a hallucination caused by malnutrition. But just so Fairley knows where his logic leads, even if we assume Ignatius did see Satan, let's remember who else saw Satan after fasting. That doesn't really work out well for Fairley's logic, does it? This one's misleading without knowing what the monks were thinking. The matter was that Ignatius wanted to preach to Muslims, which would have been a threat to his own safety. These are both correct, but Fairley had better be careful referring to that as demonic activity. He's right that such scenes are known from Christian churches today, but they were also known from the Great Awakening. And contrary to Fairley, Jonathan Edwards didn't think they were demonic. But who knows, maybe Fairley thinks the Great Awakening was demonic too, and maybe he's a better theologian than Jonathan Edwards. Despite the quote marks, Fairley's own materials are the only place this extended quote turns up in a search. I'd like to know who he's quoting here, because it smells to me like he just made it up. This vid gets a rating of half a tank. Part 34 of Know Your Enemy is titled The Spiritual Exercises, after the work of Ignatius of Loyola by that name. I'll start by saying there's zero evidence that any of this work came from, as Fairley says, the serpent-like being Ignatius saw as a vision or hallucination. And while Fairley is right that the exercises can be done over a period of 30 days, to describe them in terms of a sort of brainwashing session is quite ludicrous. I would encourage you to actually read the exercises for yourself. You'll find there's a whole lot of meditation and contemplation, but nothing in the way of, as Fairley says, being told what to think, how to feel, when to groan, what to sigh, what to imagine, or being cut off from all normal human emotion throughout those experiences. I challenge Fairley to quote any part of the exercises that say such a thing. I also challenge him to show that by following these rituals, Loyola and his followers were even seen to levitate off the floor. I find only one reference to a story told by some villagers of Ignatius levitating, but they told it over 300 years after he died. Let's see Fairley find evidence in a biography of Ignatius written by serious historians, not in sources that might as well be sold at supermarket checkout stands. Speaking of things that should be sold at checkout stands, Fairley also quotes an observer of the Jesuits as follows. Unfortunately, who this observer is hard to say, because the search finds it the same thing on a couple of decrepit websites like this one. So who is this observer, and why should we accept their testimony? Next, Fairley starts discussing the Jesuit Constitution, but if he ever saw that document, he obviously decided not to read it. There is a Jesuit Constitution of sorts. You can even buy a copy. But you won't find it in any of the words Fairley quotes as allegedly coming from it. The words he quotes are referenced as being in it by several 1800s anti-Catholic sources, but not in one single reputable historical source by a credentialed scholar, much less within the actual Constitution of the Jesuits. This is an accurate quote, but it needs a fuller context. I once looked into this quote in depth because atheists like to use it too. Fairley gets it somewhat wrong. The actual full quote from the Spiritual Exercises is as follows. Far from being some sort of epistemic guideline for all knowledge, or suggesting a model of blind obedience as Fairley puts it, it's more like a hyperbolic response to the Protestant Reformation. It also gives the ultimate source of knowledge as the Holy Spirit, which is presumed to inspire the Church. In close, Fairley delivers a sermon chastising Tony Campolo for finding good things in Ignatius' spiritual exercises, which Fairley calls poison Satan is trying to sneak in. Well, I admit I'm no fan of Campolo, but I'm going to bet Fairley hasn't even read the spiritual exercises. So here's one more challenge. Let's see him read the way Campolo has. Then let's see him write a letter or email to this scholar at Georgetown University, who has given special lectures on the spiritual exercises. I'd like to see Fairley tell him they're satanic poison and then explain why. I think it ought to be good for a few yucks. So, sorry folks, this one's empty.